quickly. Settle down.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
For historians and archaeologists, the land we now know as Iraq has the common label, the cradle of civilization. Here was home to the earliest known civilization on Earth, the Sumerian, which arose in the fertile Tigris-Euphrates River valley of southern Iraq 6,000 years ago. It was in this river valley, in the late 4th millennium BC, that the world's first writing system was born. The Sumerian people flourished in this land for over 3,000 years. By the 18th century BC, a new civilization, Babylonia, had risen to dominance in central and southern Iraq, while at the same time Assyria had formed in northern Iraq. The fertile land also drew the attention of neighboring rivals. For 3 millenniums, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, has rumbled to the sound of marching soldiers. In the 6th century, before the Common Era, Cyrus the Great of neighboring Persia, present-day Iran, defeated the Neo-Babylonian Empire. In the late 4th century before the Common Era, Alexander the Great conquered the region, putting it under Hellenistic rule for nearly 2 centuries. By the 1st century AD, the Romans invaded the region several times, marching from their territories in Syria. The region was once again a conquered outpost of Persia from 224 AD until the Islamic conquest of Mesopotamia in the 7th century. The Islamic conquest established Islam as a religion in Iraq. The city of Baghdad was built in the 8th century as their capital, and it became the leading metropolis of the Arab and Muslim world for 5 centuries. By the Middle Ages, Baghdad was the largest multicultural city in the world, peaking at a population of more than 1 million. It remained the center of learning during the Islamic Golden Age until the Mongols, led by Hulagu, a grandson of Genghis Khan, destroyed the city during the sack of Baghdad in the 13th century. The Mongols massacred most of the city's inhabitants, including the Caliph, and destroyed large sections of the city. The canals and dikes forming the city's irrigation system were also destroyed. The sack of Baghdad put an end to the Abbasid Caliphate, a blow from which the Islamic civilization never fully recovered. In the 16th century, most of the territory of present-day Iraq came under the control of the Ottoman Turks. Throughout most of the 400-year Ottoman rule, the territory of present-day Iraq was a battle zone between the rival regional empires and tribal alliances, a pattern that continues to this day.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
Afghanistan is a country at a unique nexus point where numerous civilizations have interacted and often fought. Alexander the Great and his Macedonian army arrived in the area of Afghanistan in 330 BCE after defeating Darius III of Persia a year earlier at the Battle of Gaugamela. In a letter to his mother, Alexander described the inhabitants of what is now Afghanistan.
I am involved in the land of a leonine and brave people, where every foot of the ground is like a well of steel confronting my soldier. You have brought only one son into the world, but everyone in this land can be called an Alexander.
During the 7th century, Arabs brought the religion of Islam to the western area of Afghanistan and began spreading eastward. Although some accepted the new religion, others revolted and quickly went back to their old pre-Islamic way of life. But by the late 10th century, a series of wars had forced all of the remaining non-Muslim territories to convert to Islam, with the exception of the Kafiristan region. The local Afghan tribes were constantly oppressed by the Mughals of India and the Safavids of Persia. Any uprising by the native Afghans was quickly crushed with severe consequences by these empires. But the Afghans were always planning for their next revolt, as today, the way of the warrior was in their blood. In 1826, the energetic Dost Mohammed was able to exert sufficient control over his brothers to take over the throne in Kabul, where he proclaimed himself Amir. Although the British, now in control of India, had begun to show interest in Afghanistan as early as 1809, it was not until the reign of Dost Mohammed, first of the Mohammedzai rulers, that the opening gambits were played in what came to be known as the Great Game. The Great Game set in motion the confrontation of the British and Russian empires, whose spheres of influence moved steadily closer to one another until they met in Afghanistan. At the heart of the Great Game lay the willingness of Britain and Russia to subdue, subvert, or subjugate the small independent states that lay between them.
It actually goes back more into the 1820s, and that's when we first see these British and Russian agents exploring some of the areas there. An area that was very little known, had not been mapped out, and so you had these guys, some of whom were just very fascinating. Had mastered Persian or mastered Hindi and some of the Central Asian languages, and they were wandering through there, mapping out for their respective countries the terrain, the military capabilities of the khans or rulers in that area through Central Asia, Greater Central Asia, meaning what are now the independent republics, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and so on, Pakistan, what's now Pakistan, Afghanistan, that entire area. And Iran, which was Persia at that point.
It also involved Britain's repeated attempts to impose a puppet government in Kabul. The remainder of the 19th century saw greater European involvement in Afghanistan and her surrounding territories, and heightened conflict among the ambitious local rulers as Afghanistan's fate played out globally. The Russians advanced steadily southward toward Afghanistan. By 1842, the Russian border was on the other side of the Aral Sea from Afghanistan. But 5 short years later, the Tsar's outposts had moved to the lower reaches of the Amu Darya.
Each country, the British, the Russians, each was expanding. In other words, the British were expanding northward from India. They had difficulty controlling Afghanistan. They fought 3 wars there over the course of a century. The Russians were expanding southward through the middle part of the 19th century, consolidating control over what would become Soviet Central Asia.
By 1865, Tashkent had been formally annexed, as was Samarkand 3 years later. A peace treaty in 1868 with Amir Muzaffar al-Din, the ruler of Bukhara, virtually stripped him of his independence. Russian control now extended as far as the northern bank of the Amu Darya.
So you had, the two powers coming together, each fearful of the other's expansion, each fearful that, if they did not advance, then the other would. So it's, what we would call today a typical security dilemma. each one's actions then generated mistrust in the other. And throughout much of the 19th century, the British were very fearful of what the Russians were doing.
Tension between Russia and Britain in Europe finally ended with the Congress of Berlin in June 1878. The following year, a British force of about 40,000 fighting men was formed into military columns, which penetrated Afghanistan at 3 different points. An alarmed Sher Ali attempted to appeal in person to the Tsar for assistance, but unable to do so, he returned to Mazar-e-Sharif, where he died the following February. With British forces occupying much of the country, Sher Ali's son and successor, Yaqub, signed the Treaty of Gandamak in May 1879 to prevent a British invasion of the rest of the country. According to this agreement, and in return for an annual subsidy and vague assurances of assistance in case of foreign aggression, Yaqub relinquished control of Afghan foreign affairs to the British. They would retain that control into the 20th century. World War I was a global war, and the fighting was not limited to the Western or Eastern fronts. Campaigns were launched in the Balkans, Italy, on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and the Dardanelles, in Palestine, and even the remote desert of Arabia, and along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Turks, humiliated in a series of short but bloody wars in the years immediately preceding 1914, were seriously underestimated by the Allies. The Ottoman Empire had been dismissed by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia as the sick man of Europe, but after victory over the Allies at Gallipoli, Turkey's visions of empire was renewed. The British government realized the vulnerability of strategic oil supplies from the Persian Gulf. A small military force was dispatched from India and sent to secure the Anglo-Persian Oil Company's installations at Abada. With the pipe head secured, more troops were sent from India to advance up the Shat al-Arab to Basra. Reinforced once again, the force pushed up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. 2 infantry divisions and a cavalry brigade made up the improvised Army Corps under Sir John Nixon. The Turks resisted vigorously. A second force, under the command of Major General Sir Charles Townshend, advanced up the less heavily defended Tigris with the goal of capturing Baghdad. The landscape on the road to Baghdad was harsh. Seas of drifting sand cresting into yellow dunes, thorn bushes dotting the plains, deep valleys gashing the earth, and jagged rock towers soaring 400 feet high. The bleak desert was dappled by sudden shimmering spots of green, high grassland, and lush oases packed with date trees over wells of spring water. Everything was baked under the omnipresent blistering sun. Temperatures often reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Townshend drove his men hard through the blazing desert heat. On November 20th, 1915, they reached Ctesiphon, some 25 miles south of Baghdad. Weary and low-spirited, his Indian troops failed in a mishandled attack on November 22nd. Townshend fell back on Kut and dug in, confident that he could sit it out until reinforcements of men and supplies reached him. The Turks, now under the command of the former advisor to the Sultan, General Kolmar von der Goltz, invested the garrison. A number of hastily organized attempts to rescue Townshend failed. By January 1916, supplies were running low and the garrison was forced to eat their horses. A final rescue attempt was made on April 16th, which failed. With his men starving, Townshend surrendered. His men were sent on a 1,200-mile death march in the course of which over 4,000 soldiers died. In August 1916, the arrival of General Sir Frederick Stanley Maude as Commander-in-Chief transformed the campaign. The Turks, still fighting stubbornly, were racked by disease, and they failed to stem Maude's relentless advance. The British followed close on the heels of the retreating Ottoman troops and captured Baghdad without a fight on March 11, 1917. The British troops were greeted with enthusiasm by the residents. Some 9,000 Ottoman troops were caught in the confusion and became prisoners of the British. General Maude issued the proclamation of Baghdad, which included the line, "Our armies do not come into your cities and lands as conquerors or enemies, but as liberators," a statement still famous among older Iraqis. In spite of what General Maude had to say, the British knew they needed to possess Mesopotamia's oil fields to hold onto their far-flung empire, even after the fighting ended. Gertrude Bell arrived in Iraq on the heels of the victorious British Army after a decade of on-location studies in the Mideast. Born in County Durham on July 14, 1868, to a family of great prosperity, Gertrude Bell was the daughter of the great industrialist Isaac Lothian Bell. This family wealth was later used to finance Gertrude's travels around the world. At the age of 16, Gertrude went to Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, where she became the first woman to achieve a first in history, after only 2 years of study. Thereafter, she traveled to countries such as Iran and Mesopotamia. Her fascination with Arabic culture led her to learn the Arabic language. In 1915, Gertrude was summoned to Cairo, where she worked on behalf of the Cairo office, which was helping to foment a rebellion of the Arabs against the Turks. Because of her intricate knowledge and personal dealings with the Arab tribes, Gertrude was able to offer a wealth of information and detailed maps that were used by T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, and others in the successful Arab revolt. In 1916, she arrived in Basra and was able to draw maps helping the British Army reach Baghdad. Bell became the only commissioned female officer in the British Army. For her service, she was later awarded the Commander of the Order of the British Empire. After the end of World War I, the entire map of Eastern Europe and the Near or Middle East changed drastically. 4 great empires, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Tsarist Russian, and the Turkish Ottoman, dissolved. The chaotic consequences of these dissolutions went on, in the case of the Ottoman Empire, for 5 years, involving a larger portion of the globe than in the cases of the other 3 former empires. Yet most of the results of this grandiose remaking of the map of the Middle East have remained till this day. Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Palestine, and a Jewish homeland are extant entities even now. Winston Churchill became Colonial Secretary for the British Empire in January 1921. The Middle East was now his bailiwick. His responsibilities were enormous. He was in charge of drawing the map of much of the Middle East, from which the Turks had been forced to pull out. He faced the defiance of a dozen Arab tribes and the inclinations of his Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. The Allies, Britain, France, Italy, and Greece, had imposed an impossible treaty on the defeated Turks, who were now rising under a remarkable new leader, Kemal. Much of Churchill's work was accomplished at a conference in Cairo in March 1921. Churchill's scheme was, in effect, to establish a series of pro-British client monarchies, all of whose rulers would owe Britain a debt of considerable gratitude, simply for the fact that they were in power at all. Gertrude Bell was instrumental in first negotiating the borders of Iraq, and then persuading Churchill to accept Emir Faisal Hussein as the new king of Iraq. Some scholars contend that the present tribal troubles in Iraq are derived from the lines Bell helped draw to create its borders. Kingdoms were fabricated from lines drawn on an empty map. Mesopotamia was renamed Iraq. Ignoring the orderly Ottoman system's divisions, they crammed Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Arab, and Kurdish groups into Iraq's artificial borders. Moreover, its tip was snipped off, made into Kuwait, and the tribal leaders most willing to work with the British found themselves elevated to kings. The British then rigged Iraqi elections. But Gertrude's reports indicate that problems were foreseen, and that it was clearly understood that there was just not many, if any, permanent solutions for calming the divisive forces at work in that part of the world. Churchill responded, "I hate Iraq. I wish we had never gone to the place." In spite of Winston's grumblings, Bell and her friends ensured that Britain and its military would have say over Iraq's government and oil for decades to come. After the new nation was created, Bell then acted as an advisor to King Faisal, leading some to comment she was the uncrowned Queen of Iraq. Unfortunately, the new nation of Iraq proved to be rather artificial, leading to conflicts between different tribes. To suppress Shiite and Sunni tribal revolts that followed, Britain pioneered air assaults on villages and the use of artillery shells filled with poison gas. The British learned while it is relatively easy to enter Middle Eastern countries, tribes and other groups will rise up and fight smart and hard until the enemy becomes exhausted and goes home. Britain's conflicting promises and fabrication of states created deep mistrust and cynicism in Middle Easterners that persists to this day. Gertrude Bell came to an unfortunate end in July 1926. Beset by illness and perhaps a sense of personal loneliness, she took her own life with an overdose of sleeping pills. An obituary written by her peer, David G. Hogarth, expressed the respect British officials held for her. Hogarth honored her by saying, "No woman in recent time has combined her qualities, her taste for arduous and dangerous adventure, with her scientific interest and knowledge, her competence in archaeology and art, her distinguished literary gift, her sympathy for all sorts and condition of men, her political insight and appreciation of human values, her masculine vigor, hard common sense, and practical efficiency, all tempered by feminine charm and a most romantic spirit." Hogarth may have had a romanticized image of Gertrude Bell, but his recognition of her political insight was spot on. That insight foretold of the tragic future for the new nation of Iraq and events nearly a century later that were unimagined at the time. The legacy of Churchill's Cairo Conference in 1921 and Gertrude Bell set the stage for conflict in the 21st century and poses one of the greatest security challenges of modern times as radical leaders, secular or religious, seek ways to right historical wrongs.